Bonsoir à toutes. Bonsoir Iris.
Bonsoir.
On est ravis de te recevoir pour cette première édition de la Lesbiennale. Pour moi, c'est une première aussi. Je découvre ton travail et c'est la première fois que je vais lire mon discours sur un téléphone. Donc c'est très bien, c'est voilà, une grande première. En réalité, donc, j'ai préparé un discours, mais je vais parler un petit peu de toi, de ta bio. Donc, Iris Brey est spécialiste du genre au cinéma et dans les séries. Dans son livre Sex and the Series, qui a paru aux éditions de l'Olivier en 2018, elle analyse la représentation des sexualités féminines dans les séries télévisées américaines. Iris poursuit sa réflexion sur ce sujet en réalisant une série documentaire pour OCS, peut-être que tu en parleras plus tard, en faisant 5 portraits d'héroïnes de séries qui ont changé notre regard sur les sexualités féminines. Son ouvrage, Le regard féminin, une révolution à l'écran, toujours aux éditions de l'Olivier en 2020, a remporté le prix Cosette de l'essai féministe. Et cette année, en 2021, c'est Le génie lesbien d'Alice Coffin qui a remporté ce prix. Cet ouvrage-là définit le regard féminin au cinéma et dans les séries. Iris collabore au magazine Les Inrecuptibles et Mediapart. Elle est aussi chroniqueuse dans l'émission Le Cercle sur Canal+, après avoir passé 3 ans à la Dispute sur France Culture et 1 année sur France Inter, comme chroniqueuse média dans l'Instant M. Oui, on a un peu stalké, voilà, on a fait ça, c'est Taïn qui m'a aidé à travailler là-dessus. Iris Brey est docteur en études cinématographiques et en littérature de l'Université de New York et enseigne le cinéma européen sur le campus parisien de l'Université de Californie. Elle fait partie du collectif 50-50 et elle est également réalisatrice du documentaire Sex and the Series. Écoute Iris, nous on t'a invitée, on est très, très heureuse de t'avoir là pour aborder la question du Lesbian Gaze après ton film sur le regard féminin. On s'est dit, voilà, on fait une lesbiennale à Bruxelles. On va rester dans le thème, on va parler des queens, des lesbiennes et du regard lesbien. Après la rencontre, donc Iris va nous présenter ce qu'elle a préparé, vous êtes vraiment des privilégiés, hein, elle a concocté un truc vraiment aux petits oignons pour vous. Après la rencontre, Marie Vermeer prendra le relais pour les questions, si vous en avez. Et la première question, elle est réservée à mon assistante Taïn, c'est elle qui pourra la poser, parce que c'est comme ça, on fait des passe-droits. Voilà.
Elle a de la chance.
Oui, tout à fait, c'est surtout moi. Écoutez, bonne rencontre, ça va bien se passer, à tout à l'heure.
Alors moi, je me place derrière ce pupitre. And I guess I should start speaking English, as I was asked to deliver this talk in English. I haven't spoken English in quite a long time, so I'm a little bit rusty, but I'm sure it will be fine. I have to say that this talk started as a joke. I was having lunch at Alice and Yori's place, and they were like, wouldn't it be so fun to talk about a lesbian gaze? And I thought, yeah, it would be so fun. And then they were like, you have to do it. And so I have to tell you that the last couple of weeks have been extremely stressful for me, because I know it seems like nothing, but for me it's kind of like revisiting all of the work that I've done and questioning my approach and what I know, and it's very intimidating to be here today, but I guess I'll tell you what I've come up with. So I wrote this book, Le regard féminin, the female gaze, and it came out in January 2020. In this book, I gave a definition of what the female gaze could be, a gaze that allows us to share the lived experience of a female body on screen. It is not a gaze created by female artists, but rather one that takes the point of view of a female character in order to embrace her experience. I wanted to write a book that celebrated the films that made us feel like what living in a female body could be like, not as an essence, but to show the multiplicities of these experiences. With this book, Le regard féminin, I had the hope that I would reframe film history. I wanted to highlight the cinema that embraced female experiences. I wanted to put the margins at the center. I wanted to celebrate filmmakers, mostly women, who had disappeared from our textbooks and our history just because their films focused on what the female body goes through. And when I say the female body, I mean the experiences of the biological body, like having your period, getting an abortion, getting pregnant, giving birth, having an orgasm, having multiple orgasms. And also, I wanted to give you an example of like when you have a blood clot while you're having sex, like in I May Destroy You by Michaela Cole. When I say the female body, I'm also thinking about the social body, what it's like to be a woman in a city, what it's like being afraid at night when you're walking alone, what it's like when you want to skateboard, like in Betty, the series by Crystal Moselle. I wanted to talk about the body as the collective body, and I'm borrowing this definition from the philosopher Geneviève Fraisse, who says that the collective body is not an addition of bodies, but bodies that start to speak the same language in order to denounce the way their bodies have been used by men. Just like in Big Little Lies by David E. Kelly. And I'm giving examples from TV series because it's true that I've written a lot about TV series, but also because I felt like TV series were a medium where all those bodily experiences were more present than in film. And I realized that all the experiences that were tied to the female body had been perceived as not valuable by most male filmmakers, and therefore they had not been shown in dominant cinema. And to create this female gaze, filmmakers had to bend filmic forms in order to come as close as possible to women's experiences. I argued that putting the female experience at the center of a film was and is still political, and it is also the reasons that pushed the medium of film to reinvent itself aesthetically. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Alice Guy, in her 1906 film Madame's Cravings, Madame a des envies, was the first to use the close-up for dramatic purposes and not comical use. She put her camera as close as possible to the face of a pregnant woman, putting phallic objects in her mouth so that we could feel her delight. She wanted us to no longer see a woman who was sucking on a lollipop as an erotic spectacle, but as a woman who knew how to please her cravings and to share that moment of pleasure with us. Dorothy Arzner invented the boom mic in 1929 because her actress, Clara Bow, was moving too fast on set, and she actually decided to use a fishing rod to capture the sound of her actress so that we could feel that freedom of movement. Carole Roussopoulos and Delphine Seyrig were able to make incredible documentaries when Sony's camera, the Portapak, came out because it was light and it was easy to carry and we could go in places where we had never been before. And I'm showing you an image of a movie that's called Yaka Baiser, Just Don't Fuck, that I discovered recently at an exhibition, and it was the first time in my life that I actually saw what an abortion looked like. My research showed that all the experiences that were considered linked to the female body were left off-screen in dominant cinema because the female body has no value unless it is sexualized through the male gaze. I also noticed that when male directors were producing this female gaze, like Thelma and Louise by Ridley Scott or Titanic by James Cameron, those movies became immediate cultural landmarks. It's been more than 2 years since I finished writing this book, and the female gaze as a concept that I theorized has continued to morph in my mind. I realized that I watched films, read books, and wrote unaware of my own bias, a heterosexual bias. As I was finishing the last edits on my book, I started having a relationship with a woman, and in the months that followed, I came out as a lesbian to my family and my peers. And I guess this is the first time today that I'm saying it publicly. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you today is because being a lesbian changes the way I analyze film and the way I look at film history. As the critic Pamela Hutchison says, critical writing isn't about producing a text filled with factual information. It's about sharing your vision of the film with someone else, allowing them to see it through your eyes. Living as a lesbian has changed the way I view films, it has also changed the way I do research, and it has also shed new light on my previous work. With Le Regard Féminin, I participated unknowingly to the lasting invisibility of lesbians in cinema by not questioning their omnipresence in my corpus. Rereading my book today, I finally realized that the works that pushed the female gaze to its revolutionary form were portraying either women who wanted to leave heterosexuality or lesbians reinventing love. And most of those films were directed by lesbian directors. For example, when I browse the works cited in my book, I read the names Virginie Despentes, Désirée Akhavan, Dorothy Arzner, Barbara Hammer, Rose Troshi, Sarah Gubbins, Joey Soloway, Chantal Akerman, Maya Deren, sorry, I'm repeating myself, Maya Deren, Sally Potter, Céline Sciamma, Marie-Claude Treilloux, and Germaine Dulac. And so reading all of those names, something became clear to me. I was probably in the closet for way too long, but also that these directors produced a female gaze, and they did something more than that. By putting the lesbian experience at the center, they were no longer reacting to a filmic tradition shaped by men, but they were inventing a new language. Let me give you an example. By looking at two major filmmakers of early cinema, and by comparing Alice Guy's movies with Germaine Dulac's work. Both women were incredible pioneers, and they have changed the shape of cinema. Alice Guy by directing the first narrative fiction film, and Dulac by directing the first surrealist movie. Of course, everyone says it's Buñuel, but she did the movie 1 year before. Both have put female experiences at the center of their films and have criticized the patriarchy. For me, both of them have been champions of the female gaze. But if we think of their work in terms of a lesbian gaze, we can note different approaches. In the movies where Alice Guy looks at gender dynamics, such as in La Fée aux Choux, Les conséquences du féminisme, Madame a des envies, or Matrimony's Speed Limit, she denounces the oppressions of women and how men are basically useless and have no wit. But she does not show how women could live outside of the heterosexual regime. Her characters don't try to escape. Formally, she shows that women can be filmed without a male gaze, but narratively, women still have to live in that world, and she uses humor to make us swallow that pill. Germaine Dulac in the 1920s will also depict how heterosexuality and the bourgeois marriage is hell. However, the main difference with Germaine Dulac is that in her films, the women try to escape heterosexuality and marriage, or at least they dream of it. In her masterpiece, La Souriante Madame Bedet, that came out in 1923, the main character literally dreams of smashing her abusive husband's head. And I'll show you a short clip of when she's thinking about that. I won't tell you how the film ends. You should watch it and see if she succeeds in actually killing her husband. I'm not saying that anybody should do that anyways, but in order to determine if there is a lesbian gaze in a film, one could ask him or herself, is this film inventing a new language of cinema in order to represent a character who breaks off the heterosexual contract? And I'm quoting Monique Wittig when I say breaks off the heterosexual contract. Germaine Dulac in La Souriante Madame Bedet is trying to figure out how she can translate visually the inner life of a character who wants to escape from her bourgeois marriage. Dulac wrote, "Rhythm gives the movement its inner meaning." Here, the fluid gesture of the tennis player is filmed in a single slow motion shot, which reinforces the dream quality of the sequence, but also translates a strong desire to be able to regain life in movement. It's as if Madame Bedet is still glued to her chair, and it took all of this effort to slowly depart from this state of being congealed. The only thing that could bring her back to life is to imagine how to kill her husband. And it's not surprising that Germaine Dulac made the first surrealist movie, The Seashell and the Clergyman, in 1927, and other experimental films such as L'Invitation au Voyage, as she understood that she had to play with images, dissolves, layers, close-ups. She had to dive in experimental films in order to deliver a critique of the male sexuality and attack the patriarchy. Dulac, to my knowledge, never represents characters as happily finding lesbianism, as she did herself, as she divorced and then went with her lovers even, I should say. But her experimental filmic form embodies that message that she herself is escaping conventions of traditional cinema and is actually going to launch a major movement with her surrealist film. To go back to my to me comparing Alice Guy in her films. So for me, Alice Guy is her strategy is basically to figure out how to live with men. And with Dulac, it's to show the impossibility of staying in a heterosexual system, and she's portraying characters who do not need men looking at them in order to exist. The lesbian gaze is not just representations of women or lesbian without a male gaze. It is a gaze that needs to reinvent cinema in order to come as close as possible to the lesbian experience. It is therefore not a good representation of lesbians versus the bad male gazy representation of lesbians. The lesbian gaze is a way of representing that pushes the conventions of film. The lesbian gaze is about inventing new narrative forms and technical possibilities to offer a world that resists the heteropatriarchal regime. A lesbian gaze questions the heterosexual and patriarchal systems of knowing, therefore the filmic form should reflect this reframing of the world. In The Trojan Horse, Monique Wittig writes, I quote, "Through literature, we can learn something that could be useful in any other field. In words, form and content cannot be dissociated because they partake of the same form. The form of a word, a material form. When we read Le Corps Lesbien or Les Guerrières, the form and the content cannot be dissociated. The analogy can run in film. What can be specific to the question of the lesbian gaze is that the form and content reflect this conception of lesbians not being women. Because lesbians are not women, to cite Wittig, they cannot be filmed within the same framework of dominant patriarchal cinema." And we can use Wittig's essay, One is Not Born as a Woman, as a theoretical framework to see that the lesbian gaze is not about having a film with a protagonist whose sexual orientation is for the same sex, but with a character who either refuses or tries to escape a social and I quote Wittig, a social relation to a man, a relation which implies personal and physical obligation as well as economic obligation, a relationship that lesbians escape by refusing to become or stay heterosexual. A lesbian gaze will portray heterosexuality not as a sexual orientation, but as a political regime. So what makes a character a lesbian is not a woman's attraction to another woman or showing that explicitly on screen, but a character's desire to escape the heterosexual regime. And this can only be achieved if the filmic form is also denouncing the codes of dominant cinema. As Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Therefore, a director producing a lesbian gaze will reinvent modes of narration, of filming, and probably of producing. That does not mean that the director needs to identify as a lesbian privately or publicly. However, we can assume that most directors who are lesbians, who do not need a man looking at them in order to feel like they exist, and who have learned the strategies to live or survive in a heteropatriarchal world, will reproduce those strategies in a way they make films, in the industry, and in the way they portray their characters. For this talk, I'm going to focus on 3 strategies of resistance that seems relevant to deploy the concept of the lesbian gaze. The first one will be representation of desire as a tool to dismantle the ancien régime, to quote Preciado, The second will be the circulation within the diegesis of a film, but also how a movie circulates. And the third one will be the question of engagement, engagement. And I'm not talking about the promise of getting married. I've done that, I do not recommend it. I'm talking about engagement as activism. To start with the politics of desire, let me focus on the 1974 film Je tue, il, elle. Even just the way the L is placed on the affiche of the film tells you that something is going to happen in this film. For me, Je tue, il, elle is basically a masterpiece, and I chose a very short clip that illustrates Akerman's génie lesbien. It's a 2-minute clip of the sex scene. So I only chose 2 minutes. I have to tell you the sex scene is 12 minutes, but I felt like if I showed you the 12 minutes, probably no one would listen to me after it. So I'm going to try to keep your attention. But I wanted to show you these two shots because I feel like they resonate with Wittig's quote that I said earlier. In words, form and content cannot be dissociated because they partake of the same form, the form of a word, a material form. The first, for me, the way it's working is that Akerman is playing with time, but also with expectations. Here, Akerman is filming a lesbian sex scene. I think no one has ever seen a sex scene filmed that way in fiction. But she's completely subverting the codes and the scripts of what sex looks like in dominant cinema. The idea here is to depart from the heterosexual script, which always starts with a couple kissing, and culminates in the male orgasm. Here, the focus is on the exchange. She is offering a whole new way of scripting sex and intimacy. The second element is the way Akerman films the materiality of sex. Here, the bodies have a physicality, and Akerman is achieving the sensation that we can feel them through the distance of the camera and the positions of the body. In the first shot, we can see how their hair is intertwined to one another. In the second shot, the distance allows us to see both bodies in full. They cannot be seen as body parts or objectified because Akerman films herself, because she's also playing her character and her partner, as full bodies. It gives them weight, it gives them importance. What is subversive as well is that we see a lesbian looking at another lesbian. Here, the gaze and the desire are exclusively directed to one another. The focus is on what can be shared and the pleasure of the sensation of touching another woman. The women are at the center of the frame and no longer left at the margin. I would like to turn to the writings of Nicole Brossard on what constitutes une littérature lesbienne, a lesbian literature. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the works of two PhD students, Aurore Turbiot and Margot Lashkar, whose work on l'écriture lesbienne in literature have helped me put in focus how these concepts operate also in the filmic world, and give a shout out to their website, and because they share everything, their methodologies, their insight, their research, and it's really thanks to them that I've discovered this paper, and it's probably thanks to them that I'm doing this conference today, and I'm also giving a shout out to everyone who's trying to do a PhD because it's hell, just like heterosexual marriage. I've done both. So in a 1997 conference, even though I have to tell you my husband is still a very nice person if he ever listens to this conference. Anyways, in a 1997 conference, Brossard gave a short paper. And in her conclusion, she says, and I'm going to quote this in French first because then I'm giving you my translation, and my translation really sucks, so I'd rather say it in French. La lesbienne est une proposition, et sa proposition est sexuelle. Parce que sexuelle, elle suscite étonnement et questions qui bousculent le bon sens et la raison. Sa proposition remet en question la grammaire sexuelle, brouille les points de repère fantasmatiques et invite au voyage. Bien que cela puisse sembler contradictoire, c'est parce que la proposition lesbienne est sexuelle qu'elle agit symboliquement et qu'elle est symboliquement éclairante. This is my really bad translation. the lesbian is a proposition, and this proposition is sexual. Because it's sexual, it creates awe and interrogations that disrupt common sense and logic. This proposition questions sexual grammar, it blurs the phantasmatic landmarks, and it invites us to take on a journey. Even if it seems contradictory, it is because the lesbian proposition is sexual that it acts symbolically, and that it is symbolically illuminating. So if we think in terms of a... c'est le Saint-Esprit de Germaine. It is illuminating, visibly. If we think in terms of lesbian gaze, we have to turn to its politics of desire. And I do not know if the lesbian gaze is a proposition that is sexual, why not? But in my eyes, shaping a new politics of desire. Paul Preciado explains, and I'm quoting him, that a necropolitical heterosexuality is a practice of government that takes the form of sexual servitude based on the aesthetics of seduction, a stylization of desire, and a historically constructed and coded domination which eroticizes the difference of power and perpetuates it. So we can assess that the omnipresence of the male gaze in film has operated in the same way. It has established a norm, cinematic codes that have taught us to desire through the domination of the female body, or bodies. In turn, we could view the lesbian gaze as a way of reinventing the cinematic grammar of desire and rescripting what constitutes sexual acts. And I'm thinking of the sex scenes in Go Fish. I'm thinking of the sex scenes in Watermelon Women. I'm thinking of the sex scenes in Bound. I'm thinking of the sex scenes in Rafiki, and I'm thinking of the sex scenes in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It is an armpit if you haven't seen the film, and I'm thinking of all the sex scenes that are yet to come. The lesbian gaze as a proposition of politics of desire that is no longer built through the difference of power, but through the eroticization of sharing and looking at one another, can be an epistemological transformation. This is already what I had argued in Le Regard Féminin. When I look at the chapter I wrote on jouissance, it is no surprise that I mainly cite Chantal Akerman, Barbara Hammer, and Joey Soloway. The politics of desire, in my eyes, is the biggest weapon we have to eradicate rape and incest culture. Spreading these images could have a profound social impact as well as a symbolic one. That is why these films and these directors are met with such resistance, which brings me to the idea of circulation. Circulation, how one is allowed to move freely and escape from a static state, can be a productive motive to look for. Filming the escape as a gesture of resistance, a body trying to free itself. It's something that's present in Germaine Dulac's work, as we've seen, but it's also omnipresent in Chantal Akerman's filmography, from Saute ma ville to La Captive. Even in Les Rendez-vous d'Anna or Jeanne Dielman, where the main protagonist's sexual orientation is heterosexual or unknown, the filmic form indicates how the character tries to escape the heterosexual regime and produces, to my eyes, a lesbian gaze. So why is the lesbian gaze important as a concept? Because works that are shot through the lesbian gaze are at a much higher risk of disappearing of film history, and they're often very hard to find, to watch, and they don't know the same circuits of circulation. And I want to spend a moment talking about the resistance with which Chantal Akerman's work is met. I would argue that it is because she made movies that deeply questioned the heteropatriarchal regime through a lesbian gaze that her work is not as well known as it should be. Let's consider the different treatments Chantal Akerman and Agnès Varda have received in France. And I know I'm going to say things that are probably not going to sit well with some people, but I'm going for it. Both are recognized for being women filmmakers who had a huge influence on cinema, while depicting stories from the point of view of female protagonists. One could argue that Varda received most of her recognition in the later part of her life, and maybe Akerman would have known the same treatment if she had lived longer. it is impossible to tell. But when I read the Wikipedia entry for Varda, Wikipedia, you know, that source that we love as scholars, but still it's important to understand what's going on. So when I'm looking at the Varda Wikipedia entry in English, this is how the introduction ends. I quote Wikipedia. Director Martin Scorsese describes Varda as one of the gods of cinema. Among several other accolades, Varda received an honorary Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, a Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, an Academy Honorary Award, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Varda is the only female director to be feted with an honorary Oscar. And this is how Akerman's introduction ends. She has been best known for her film Jeanne Dillman, which the New York Times called a masterpiece. According to film scholar Gwendoline Audrey Foster, Akerman's influence on feminist and avant-garde cinema is substantial. Now, my point is not to pitch against each other two great filmmakers, but to understand how the legacy of one works is constructed. Agnès Varda was married to Jacques Demy, and the fact that she was presented as his wife probably protected her. 18 years after Jacques Demy's death, Varda revealed that he had died of AIDS, and the readings of Demy's work as queer emerged in academia and in mass media. However, to my knowledge, I've never read a piece questioning Varda's queer gaze, or even maybe her flirtation with the lesbian gaze. Now, this might be the time to acknowledge why I chose to talk about a lesbian gaze and not a queer gaze. The term queer gaze and new queer cinema was coined in 1992 by Ruby Rich, and since a number of academic books have presented under that label works that offer representations of the LGBTQI+ characters. But let's stop and look at this book that came out called French Queer Cinema by Nick Rees-Roberts, and it came out in 2014. And this is what's written in its introduction. The corpus includes recent queer-themed films by Patrice Chéreau, Olivier Ducastel and Jacques Martineau, Christophe Honoré, Sébastien Lifshitz, Gaël Morel, Jacques Nolot, François Ozon et André Téchiné. Alice Coffin, in her book Le Génie lesbien, quotes Anne-Christine Dadeschi, who says, "When you choose the term queer, you participate in making the women invisible." By choosing the term lesbian gaze, I do not want to make trans or non-binary people, or people that don't even identify with the category women, invisible in turn. I believe that choosing the word lesbian instead of queer is in fact opening a space to think of people that don't feel like they want or can operate in a patriarchal and heterocentric society. Naming and reframing what the term queer holds is an ongoing conversation that is generating fascinating text, and I'm thinking of A Nazi World for a Nazi Thing by So Mayer, for example. But I just want to point out that queer, when it is associated with cinema, and in some of academia, has given rise to not distinguishing what queer cinema could be, and has just become synonymous of gay directors. And in my opinion, a director who does not identify as gay or lesbian can still produce a queer movie. And I do not think that a director needs to identify publicly as a lesbian to produce a lesbian gaze. And I don't think that all lesbian directors film through a lesbian gaze. We do not need to have access to the personal life of a director to identify if a movie projects this lesbian gaze. But the personal life of a director will probably shape his or her cinematic vision. So let's go back to Varda, because I still like her. And I want to complexify the way we can conceptualize the female and the lesbian gaze. I would argue that films like Cléo de 5 à 7 or L'une chante, l'autre pas are shot through the female gaze because the female characters questions how to escape the male gaze, how to escape a form of sexual servitude, and how to use connection to other women to destabilize the patriarchy. But in the end of the films, there is always this return to a status quo because her heroines cannot exist without a man looking at them. However, I would argue that Sans toi ni loi, Vagabond in English, is probably her most radical proposition, narratively, and it could be considered, in my eyes, lesbian gaze. From the start, the movie opens with the death of Mona, and the movie is constructed as a flashback, so we know from the start what happens to women who break off the heterosexual contract. But the same ending can be found in films of Germaine Dulac or Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, where women let themselves die or commit suicide, not finding another way out. Varda's aesthetic in Vagabond is to formally always be looking for movement and filming Sandrine Bonnaire always on the outskirts, on the fringe, being borderline. Filming the limits could be what the lesbian gaze is about. The physical limits, geographically, where can the lesbian exist? Where can this individual be filmed? I'm thinking of Simone Barbès ou La Vertu by Marie-Claude Triou, where the main character works in a cinema that plays pornography in the first part of the film and wanders through Paris at night in the second part while longing for her female lover. I'm also thinking of Vanda by Barbara Loden, where Vanda leaves behind her husband and children. The last shot of the film is this one. It's a freeze frame. And I've argued in Le Regard Féminin that the freeze frame is a call for viewers to get out of their frozen state, to get closer to their desire. The lesbian gaze asks for a new cartography of cities and the rural areas. It also asks how to film the edges and the body's cartographies, reframing where a body ends and the areas where two bodies meet. The lesbian gaze also so the question is how to film intimacy, how to film what can only happen behind closed doors. But it's also how can we film the lesbian sex? And I think Barbara Hammer has given us one of the most wonderful films, and so I'm going to show it to you this time in its entirety because it's only a couple of minutes long. It's called Dyke Tactics, and it came out in 1974. I know that theory can be a little bit dry, so at least I put some sex in there so that you wouldn't be too bored, but I'm almost done. In the DVD commentary, Barbara Hammer says, and I quote her, "My films are experimental. Being a lesbian is experimental. We create a new life for us, so why wouldn't we create a new form of media? My language is a new cinematographical language." And in this film, just like in Akerman, we can see that the choice of length, of always cutting, it's never too long, it's always cut at the right moment, and being so close to the bodies make us feel like we can almost touch them without sexualizing them, but still filming a sexual act. And this takes me to my third strategy around what engagement could be. The critic Nicole Brenes have worked around the notion of cinéma engagé, and I think it's a really important notion that I would translate as activist cinema. And what Nicole Brenes shows is that she prefers the term cinéma engagé than cinéma militant, because the word militant, the Latin root, refers to militare, the soldier, and so a soldier is always paid for something, whereas in the idea of cinéma engagé, there's the notion of mettre en gage, to pawn something or to pawn in somebody's game. So it's a more personal and riskier approach to cinema. And I believe that we could actually approach the lesbian gaze in the same direction, because as the director feels engaged in the way he or she wants to show us something that has not been seen before. And I believe that the lesbian gaze is also asking us to remain active while we are watching and never be passive. And the fact that lesbian gaze is always pushing the border of what has been done and how it's been done, it's always making us active viewers. And Somayer even speaks of activist viewing. And I quote him, "As activist viewing, as a difference disrupts passive reception and calls us to attention, the the plurality of meanings created by juxtapositions calls us to action. And this quote makes me think of films by Barbara Hammer, by Mara Deren, by Sue Frederick, by Dulac. And I'm not going to have time to go back to Dulac, but I just want to say something really quickly, is that there's a book that came out in 2020 that was edited by a film scholar called Tammy Williams. And it's a book that contains all of Germaine Dulac's conferences. And before that book, I had never realized the amount of theoretical work that Germaine Dulac had done in the 1920s. And when I went to school and I did my PhD, I read all of the texts by André Bazin and from Jean Epstein, and I thought that André Bazin was the first one to ask the question, what cinema is, but actually Germaine Dulac had done it before him, a long time before him. And I was really moved to discover that book, and Tammy Williams has always done amazing work on Germaine Dulac and has done a book also called The Cinema of Sensations. But what moved me when I had the book between my hands and I read all of these really strong theoretical texts is that the reason why I had that book in my hands today is because Dulac's partner, Marie-Anne Colson-Malville, is the one who archived everything. And that without this lesbian relationship and this love for Marie-Anne Colson-Malville to Germaine Dulac, today we wouldn't have all of these texts and she would still be forgotten. Even though I'm still waiting for Dulac to be presented as André Bazin, as one of the basically big thinkers of what cinema is. But Dulac's case raises several points. First of all, it shows how women directors have always been erased from official film history. It also raises the questions of the archive and how to be remembered, and how our work can be framed. And I want to share this quote from Somayer. Practices from the margins risk failure and re-erasure. They form not an archive, but an anarchive, a living and therefore unassimilable web of interconnections that can only be seen in fragments as they scintillate. We have been told that there's only one history of cinema. The same single narrative has been told over and over again in our textbook, in our universities, in the way we teach them. Always the same names, and mainly names of men. But maybe our approach through the lesbian gaze is not to edict a parallel history with a beginning, a middle, and an end of film history, but to look at it as a map. As Somayer says, a web of interconnections that can only be seen in fragments that scintillate. When I hear that sentence, I think about this, but not only. More seriously, not sticking to the idea that there's only one history or that we should establish one, but instead embracing the fact that we have fragments and that it is the way we tie them to one another that can create a new narrative is also a way of acknowledging the missing dots and the missing anarchive and the missing filmmakers. Ilana Eloi and Claire Hemmings did this book called Lesbian Ghost Feminism, and in their introduction they write this. While lesbian politics and experiences have often erased or euphemized in the history of feminism, we wanted instead to argue that this absence can be considered an instance of feminist haunting, which Avery Gordon has characterized as something's to be done, an unresolved feminist contradiction which has not only impacted the way feminist theory is framed, but also how feminist stories have been and are being told. Attending the vaporous there-ness of ghosts, we also wanted to follow Gail Lewis in her strategy of presenting the untold stories and subjects obscured by dominant histories, both within and outside feminism. And I want to share another quote where they present their methodology, because I believe this methodology could be used in our search for the lesbian gaze. The politics of visibility or recognition seem to have little to offer to us as our goals shape-shift, even as we think we have them cornered, ready to capture on camera. As such, chasing ghosts calls for a reconsideration of traditional hierarchies between researchers and objects of studies. Ghosts will always be ahead of the researchers, beating the latter to their own game. They will always thwart attempts to control them and assign singular meanings to their presence. Ghosts are elusive, dismissive, terribly smart and brave, and perhaps most importantly, they love playing around and laughing at us. Thus, the tools we might need to survive and even thrive in the face of our ghostly lesbian encounters might include touch, smell, paranoia, rumors, memory, access to the memories of others or their DNA, tall as well as short stories, destructive exits, and a dash of the hyperbolic. We might need to sit and wait as well, or listen carefully to the vibrations in the room. Thus, in order to exercise ghost, we must be attentive to detail, or follow our instincts in order to see what is supposed to not be there. Following the ghosts implies having a particular relationship to our objects of study, one that is not characterized by mastery, but by a willingness to be surprised, touched physically and emotionally, and changed by them. What I presented today are my first thoughts, and what could constitute a lesbian gaze. I believe that relying on Wittig's theoretical and literary writings is a way to understand how the lesbian gaze in cinema is a way of presenting characters that denounce heterosexuality. I don't want to say that word anymore. How to denounce heterosexuality, not as a sexual orientation, but as a system, is a way of presenting narratives in which characters try to escape this regime, is a way of presenting a politics of desire built on equality. And that telling those stories through a lesbian gaze continually renews cinematographical codes and our visual grammar. We look at these films through the lesbian gaze in order to create a new cartography of cinema and desire, and no longer a linear history, to embrace a methodology that is based on being touched physically and emotionally, as if we were following the ghosts, the lesbian ghosts that we encounter in arts and the lesbian lovers that still haunt us. This approach is a way of destabilizing the hierarchies established by dominant cinema, of questioning the ideology that lies behind the way the history of cinema is presented and has been presented as neutral when it has erased so many names of the ones that offered a different perspective. And I'm going to quote Soulmeyer to finish this. The history we carry is our history, each of us an archive, perhaps of untaken photographs and destroyed films, or work we will never have the opportunity to see or make, but also of the yearning to make the impossible work possible. This is the secret we keep. People like us whom power tries to deny, that immortality lives in our continuous resistance, is in us, is us. Thank you.
Il faut crier. Hein.
Oui, il faut avoir de la voix.
Ok. Merci beaucoup, vraiment, pour cette exposition et pour cette conférence. Ma question, c'est plutôt sur le lien entre la forme filmique et le lesbian gaze.
Attends, entre
la forme filmique et la lesbian gaze. En fait, est-ce qu'on est obligé de s'adresser aux formes expérimentales pour parler de notre sexualité? Et est-ce que c'est est-ce que c'est le choix des cinéastes ou est-ce que on est obligé parce qu'on doit créer des nouvelles formes, de nouvelles manières de montrer? Et sinon, parce que c'est si vite, du coup, si on est obligé ou si c'est notre choix, bah, ça fait que on va produire que des films expérimentaux et on ne va jamais voir ces films à la Cinémathèque. Et du coup, merci beaucoup.
Oui, alors, donc la question c'est est-ce qu'on est obligé d'aller vers une forme expérimentale pour produire du lesbian gaze et qu'est-ce qu'on va faire puisque sinon on verra jamais ces films en dehors de la cinémathèque. Alors, déjà, je pense par exemple que Akerman pour moi n'est pas du tout du cinéma expérimental, même si c'est peut-être pas considéré comme du cinéma mainstream. Pour moi, c'est vraiment des films de fiction. Et c'est vrai que dans certains exemples que j'ai donnés, que ce soit de Bound au film de Céline Sciamma, à Rafiki, pour moi tout ça c'est vraiment du cinéma très accessible et grand public. Mais je pense que en fait, même dans ces films-là, il y a une manière de réfléchir à la forme filmique et à des manières de résister. Ça peut être de manière subtile. Par exemple, dans le film de Céline Sciamma, quand au bout d'1 heure et demie de film, il y a un homme qui arrive, la salle va rire. Parce que dans la salle, il y a déjà sûrement, les personnes dans la salle ont sûrement déjà compris de quoi parlait le film et peut-être sont sensibles à cette expérience-là. Et du coup, l'arrivée d'un homme, en fait, c'est comme un jump scare. Donc en fait, on est en train d'utiliser des codes cinématographiques vraiment très identifiés dans le cinéma d'horreur, mais là, placé dans ce film-là, à ce moment-là, c'est extrêmement drôle. Donc ça, peut-être que c'est l'humour lesbien, il faudrait peut-être une conférence sur ça. Moi, ça me fait beaucoup rire. Mais ça, c'est une forme, par exemple, de résistance, mais aussi on expérimente, parce que ça veut dire que les cinéastes font confiance à la salle et font confiance aux spectateurs et aux spectatrices de comprendre en quoi est-ce que ça va être drôle. Et c'est évidemment aussi une question de mise en scène. Donc, c'est vrai que, en fait, il y a une autre vraie question derrière cette question, c'est que comment est-ce qu'on filme le sexe féminin sans tomber en fait dans la catégorie pornographie. Donc parce que donc je rentre dans des choses spécifiques mais qui en fait influencent quand même la manière dont on peut filmer des scènes de sexe sans être considéré comme film X ou interdit aux moins de 18 ans. Par exemple, on peut aussi réfléchir à Baise-moi de Virginie Despentes qui a été interdit en salle et donc réfléchir à tout ce contexte-là de comment en fait, la classification va permettre à certaines choses d'être montrées ou non dans un circuit mainstream. Donc, en ce qui concerne les interdictions, on ne peut pas avoir un sexe masculin en érection. Ça, sinon, ça devient de la pornographie. Mais il y a beaucoup d'autres choses qu'on peut montrer. Et on pourrait penser que c'est donc la même chose. Donc, on ne pourrait pas montrer en fait, un clitoris en érection. Donc en fait, on pourrait montrer plein de choses. Seulement, on ne les voit pas, ces choses-là, et c'est des images qui sont vraiment des images manquantes. Et c'est vrai qu'on passe par le cinéma expérimental pour pouvoir les projeter. Je pense notamment, par exemple, à un film qui s'appelle Sorcière de Camille Dusselier, où on voit une militante féministe qui est maintenant décédée, qui s'appelle Thérèse Claire, qui se masturbe. Et on a vraiment un très très gros plan de son clitoris. Et je me souviens que j'ai projeté en fait cette image de manière illégale dans les rues de Paris. Et j'ai un groupe d'hommes qui est arrivé. Et donc j'ai forcément toujours la petite appréhension parce que on est la nuit à Paris dans une rue et que je projette donc une image pornographique avec un clitoris en érection. Et la première réaction, c'était « Ah, mais je savais pas qu'on pouvait faire ça à cet âge-là », parce qu'elle a plus de 80 ans dans la vidéo. Et ça m'a vachement interpellée, parce que voilà, ma propre peur a été dépassée, et surtout, je me suis dit qu'il manquait, évidemment, que ces images-là soient dans le cinéma dominant. Et je pense qu'on peut réinventer les formes filmiques sans passer par la case cinéma expérimental, et que le cinéma dominant devrait s'ouvrir en fait à ce qu'on appelle cinéma expérimental. Mais je ne sais pas si ça donne des pistes de réflexion.
Encore une autre... Ah ben voilà.
Bon.
Oui, vas-y.
Du coup, j'ai une question qui est un peu liée aussi sur le cinéma mainstream. C'est, en fait, quand vous parlez du lesbian gaze comme ça, parfois on a l'impression que ça peut être plutôt un outil pour, entre guillemets, démanteler le système hétéronormatif, etc. Mais je me dis, et là je reprends vos mots quand vous parliez pour le coup du regard féminin dans votre livre, pour moi réfléchir au regard lesbien, c'est réfléchir à la manière dont un ou une cinéaste va prendre en compte les expériences que les corps et des spectatrices lesbiennes ou enfin des femmes queer
sont susceptibles de traverser. Or, pour moi, on ne peut pas trop oublier que voilà, c'est surtout par le cinéma mainstream qu'on se construit, donc par la non-représentation, puis la représentation qui est tout le temps soit on va se faire agresser, tuer, enfin, même quand c'est pour dénoncer en fait, le système hétéronormé, ça va être... on va nous malmener en fait, à l'écran. Et du coup, pour moi, notamment, pour satisfaire entre guillemets les jeunes adolescentes queer, par exemple, est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas aussi, à côté, rentrer dans des codes un peu mainstream, leur donner leur happy ending, un peu téléfilm de Noël, etc. Ça, pour moi, c'est aussi en fait quelque chose de radical dans le regard féminin, c'est pouvoir donner la possibilité à ces spectatrices lesbiennes d'imaginer des récits sains, des relations saines dans le futur. Et ça passe pas forcément tout le temps par le cinéma expérimental. Enfin voilà, je sais pas si c'est clair comme question.
Alors, moi, très clairement, je pense que ça passe par les séries. Et je pense que les séries sont une forme filmique qui peut se permettre des choses extrêmement expérimentales. Et qui restent quand même des séries produites par Amazon. Je pense par exemple à I Love Dick de Sarah Gubbins et Joey Soloway, où il y a plusieurs scènes de sexe lesbiennes. Je pense aussi par exemple à une série qui est sortie l'année dernière, dont la saison 2 est en train d'être montrée, qui s'appelle Work in Progress, de Abby McInerney, où on est vraiment sur quelque chose d'extrêmement traditionnel, mais elle tombe amoureuse d'un jeune homme trans, et il va y avoir tout un truc autour du dead name et de la manière dont le dead name va être mis en scène. Ça, par exemple, pour moi, c'est expérimental. C'est quelque chose qu'on n'a jamais vu avant, et la réalisatrice va réfléchir à comment est-ce qu'on peut incarner le fait qu'elle ait prononcé son nom, et visuellement. Et donc, ça va être vraiment une recherche autour de ça. Et ça, par exemple, pour moi, on est dans un renouveau des codes, on est sur des images que je n'ai jamais vues, et on est sur un regard lesbien, pour moi, à ce moment-là. Et c'est une série produite par HBO. Alors oui, souvent, ces séries-là, on va me dire, c'est des séries de niche, parce qu'elles ne sont pas vues autant que Game of Thrones. Mais bon, le problème, c'est qu'il faut de tout pour faire un monde, et qu'en fait, ces séries-là, déjà, elles existent. Et le fait que ce soit des séries, tu peux les regarder chez toi, dans ton intimité, où tu as envie de les regarder. Tu peux aussi les regarder de manière illégale. Donc, en fait, il y a un accès, et ça devient, pour moi, vraiment, c'est ce que je disais dans mon premier livre, dans Sex and the Series. Pour moi, c'est le pendant de la pornographie, quoi. Et que ceux et celles qui ont envie d'autres représentations peuvent avoir accès à d'autres représentations dans les séries. Il faut savoir où chercher, mais j'ai l'impression que de toute façon, il y a beaucoup... Les personnes qui ont envie de se voir ont beaucoup de stratégies en fait, pour se trouver. Et c'est évidemment important de générer ce corpus-là aussi.
On me dit qu'il faut arrêter.
Voilà.
Donc, merci beaucoup, mais je pense qu'elle doit revenir. On va faire tout un colloque, toute une journée de discussion. Très bien. Voilà, ce serait chouette. Non, merci beaucoup. Ça ouvre, plus que des portes, je trouve ça ouvre des fenêtres et ça donne de l'air frais, tu vois. Parce que par exemple, ce serait intéressant de savoir c'est quoi un film expérimental, tu vois. Est-ce que c'est simplement expériencé, on rentre... enfin bref.